We are MythVision. Hey, what's up, everybody? Today we're going to be going into part 2 of Contradictions, Conflicting Contradictions. This one's going to be in the New Testament with Dr. Robert.m.Price. Be sure to go down in the description, show him some love. Guys, I'm not going to go into long detail here at the intro. Just check out the description. I love you guys. I hope you enjoy this. Thanks for supporting MythVision Podcast. Peace. Yeah, so you concluded the Old Testament, though there are many more. I mean, in terms, you just pretty much wanted to give us a summary. Now we're going to delve into the New Testament and have fun there, because that's kind of like, I think, you know, when you talk to like Catholics and stuff, okay, when you talk to the more Orthodox, what I find is they'll go with you and go, yeah, some of them. Oh, yeah, the Old Testament, we get it, you know, we get it. Allegory, myth, here, there, whatever. Okay, we can do that with you. But when you start getting near our sacred text, you start getting real close to that New Testament, you better watch what you're saying. And that's what I notice with Catholics and those who are Orthodox. So I think this will be an interesting point you're going to bring here into the New Testament for this part 2.
Yeah, and the whole eyewitness nonsense comes in there. Well, the Old Testament was really ancient, and who knew what really happened? But the New Testament, that was written by eyewitnesses of Jesus. Sure, yeah. So what about the 2 genealogies of Jesus? One in Matthew chapter 1, the other in Luke chapter 3. They can't be reconciled there, and neither one of them appear to be authentic. Luke, they both, I guess the real punchline is that both explicitly trace the descent of Jesus through Joseph, though at the end they kind of jog a little bit. They get kind of cagey, and let's take a look at that in Matthew 1:17. You have Matthew. Sorry about that. It's Matthew. Verse 16, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Now, that wouldn't pose much of a problem if we didn't have what at least is usually taken to be a miraculous conception story, right? If Joseph wasn't actually the father, that's certainly the necessary implication of the miraculous conception thing. And then what does Luke do? Something similar, but in Luke, it's slightly different. Luke 3. Let's see. I think it's 30. Yeah, okay. 3:23. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mathat, etc. Well, in other words, somebody is trying to harmonize this with the virginal conception story of Luke, which differs from Matthew's nativity in a number of ways. But they both have Joseph as the last paternal link. Apologists love to say, well, the other one is Mary's genealogy. Now, why would that be, since both of them say they're Joseph's genealogy, they're Joseph's line of descent leading to Jesus? Well, some say, well, you see, that's what they did in ancient Judaism. They would sometimes give the mother's name, but use the father's. Use the father's name on the mother's genealogy. So, what we have in Matthew is actually Joseph's, but in Luke, it's Mary's. I asked Jacob Neusner, a rabbi, and and the world's authority on ancient Judaism. And he said he'd never heard of such a thing. Somebody's just making stuff up. And so that's a desperate expedient that just fails. Luke is, well, both of them have Jesus descended from David for obvious reasons. They both want to have Jesus fulfill what they thought was the prediction that the Messiah would have to be of the line of David. And that was a widespread view. And but the Lucan genealogy is packed with Levitical names you would hear among Levites, priestly names, Mathat, Mattathias, lots of different versions of that. And in Matthew's, it has many less generations than Luke does, and he miscounts the generations he has because he pauses and sums up, oh, you see 14 generations from this point to that, and another 14 from this to that, but it's either something's dropped out of the manuscript in the process of copying, or or he just didn't count right, which is not too difficult to imagine. But this is further complicated by the fact that there is an old Syriac manuscript of Matthew that doesn't have that little jog. It just says Joseph was the father of Jesus, and which implies, this might have been the original reading before somebody decided to change it to make it compatible with a miraculous conception story. And so it's really tricky, and in a way you can give whoever compiled these things a little slack, not much, but suppose they didn't really have any genealogical records of Jesus, and that could be true even if there was a historical Jesus, but they just made the connections they thought most likely. I'm pretty sure that's what genealogists do sometimes today. They don't have a whole truckload of evidence about your ancestors, and they say, well, this guy's a similar name, maybe he's the father of this one. But there's just no way to get those together. So somebody is trying to give Jesus messianic credentials. That's why Chronicles has so darn many boring genealogies. They're really credentials for the priests in the chronicler's day. But back to the New Testament, where did Jesus' parents live? Well, in Matthew, we're told that they lived in Bethlehem, and Jesus was born in their home. And once Herod heard about this, of course, he sent his goon squad out to get rid of him by eliminating all the babies in town, and that's when they fled to Egypt. And then some years later got the word from an angel that the coast was clear, they could go back because Herod was dead. But then the angel gets an update and appears to Joseph again and says, whoops, sorry, I kind of jumped the gun there. Herod's son Archelaus is on the throne now, and he's as much of a bad guy as his dad was. Maybe you better go up north to Nazareth. Yeah, that ought to do it. So, okay, Jesus is born where Mary and Joseph live, in Bethlehem, from whence they go to Egypt, and then they're headed back to Bethlehem, but the angel then says, nah, go to Nazareth. What does Luke have? Well, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth to begin with, but then they have to go to Bethlehem because of a Roman census, of which there's no historical record, and they have to go to Bethlehem because Joseph is of the house of David, and David lived there 1,000 years before. Why are they taking a census? Well, they want to know how many kids you have and where you live, so they'll know where to send the tax collector when it comes time. No one would issue an edict for a census has you going to be registered where your remote ancestors lived a millennium before, right? Luke's just got to get him to Bethlehem somehow, and the census thing is the expedient. And then they come back home to Nazareth and don't go to Egypt at all. Which way is it? Well, it swarms with contradictions, but the reason both of them play the shell game as to where Mary and Joseph lived was because they were trying to harmonize a contradiction that existed already in their own day. Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, which they thought meant, perhaps not correctly, meant that he was Jesus, the guy from the village of Nazareth. But why would they have called him that if he hailed from Bethlehem, as another prophecy said the Messiah had to? Why wasn't he called Jesus of Bethlehem? I said, well, how about this? He was born in Bethlehem, but lived in Nazareth. Yeah, what the heck? Why not? Well, it's pretty clever, but the stories just grossly contradict one another. Each has big internal problems, too. But good luck getting those together. Let's see. When the voice from the sky speaks to Jesus at his baptism, what does it say in Matthew 3:17? This is my beloved son. But in Mark 1:11 and in Luke 3:22, he says, "You are my beloved son." And in some manuscripts of Luke, he says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," which is a quote from Psalm 2. But let's just stick with Matthew and Luke. Did the heavenly voice say both? This is my beloved son, you are my beloved son. Well, why the difference? I'm assuming Matthew changed Mark. He wanted to avoid the implicit adoptionism of Mark, as if Jesus only now learns that he is the Son of God. God has to tell him. And it's not even suggested that anybody on the scene heard this but Jesus. Right? He heard a voice saying, but Matthew has a nativity story in which Jesus is already revealed as the Messiah. So he has the voice tell the crowd this, hey, this guy here, he's my son, he's the Messiah. He didn't say both, and Matthew knew that. He's changing it because it's the story that matters to him, not the history. Again, he's not stupid. He's not exactly even wrong, because anybody that can change the story this way knows he's telling a story, not necessarily recounting history. And by the way, in the Gospel of John, there's no heavenly voice. It's John the Baptist who says, "Behold, the elect of God," or some manuscripts say the Lamb of God. So he says it, not God. Hey, well, which temptation was Jesus offered last? Did Satan take Jesus to the temple pinnacle last, third, as in Luke 4:9? Or did he take him to a high mountain, as in Matthew 4:8, where he could see the panorama of world kingdoms? Now, both Gospels have all three temptations, but the order is not the same. Why does that make any difference? Well, I'm not absolutely sure it does, but it's conceivable that Matthew thought it was the more dramatic one to end off with, and that being offered the rulership of the world, he turned that one down. But there's no way to what did Jesus? Was he taken to the mountain and then the temple and then back to the mountain? No, it's absurd. No way to do it. Again, it makes sense if you're talking about a redactional change by an editor, but otherwise it's just stupidity or clumsiness. Let's see. Did Jesus list the signs that would signal that the kingdom of God was near? Well, in Mark 13:28 through 30, the Olivet Discourse, he sure does. And he does in the other parallels to that in Matthew 24 and in Luke's part of it in 17, part of it in 21. But in Luke 17, Jesus says there's not going to be any advance warning. When asked by the Pharisees, I guess it is, when the kingdom of God would arrive, he said, the kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed, calculated, watched for, nor will they say, lo, here it is, or there. Rather, the kingdom of God is within you. Did Luke notice there was a problem with what he had in chapter 21, where he lists the signs? Maybe not. Who knows? But it's a little hard to get those together. Of course, like Timothy Colani, a Catholic scholar, said back in the 19th century, it may be that originally Luke did not have the list of signs that like he cut them out of Mark, so to speak, and simply had this. But somebody decided to harmonize Luke with the others and added in a version of the Olivet Discourse. Who knows? But that makes a little more sense than Jesus just forgetting what he said before, changing his mind. Let's see. What about fasting? I always like this one. Did Jesus, what did he teach about fasting? Did he say his disciples would no longer fast? Well, seems like that in Mark 2:21 through 22. Or did he say they would suspend fasting temporarily, as in the same passage, but chapter 2:18 through 20? When the bridegroom is taken away, well, then they'll fast. But then, that'll be over and they won't anymore. Or did he say they should fast, but not like the hypocrites in Matthew 6:16 through 18? Oh yeah, fast, but observe some different rules. Or as in the Gospel of Thomas, did he say, don't fast, you'll do evil to your spirits? Good question. I mean, to me, it seems obvious that what we have is a record of different Christian opinions, all attributed to Jesus for authority's sake. But anyway, did Jesus allow for divorce? In Mark 10:2 through 9 and Luke 16:18, the way they're usually read, Jesus allows no excuse for divorce. But in Matthew 5:31 through 32, there is one excuse. If he says, if a man puts away his wife for any cause except for porneia, then he forces her to become an adulteress by marrying somebody else. What was porneia? Well, it could mean a lot of things, but it's purposely vague. Just means marital impropriety. It could mean you had married somebody Leviticus said you shouldn't, like a cousin or something like that. Or it could mean she had committed adultery against the guy, though in that case they probably would have used the word moichia, which has to mean adultery. Or he's trying to just be cagey and leave it as ambiguous as Deuteronomy did, when it says if he finds something untoward in her, let him give her a bill of divorce. Well, good luck figuring out what to do on that. Who walked on water in the Gospels? Well, in Mark 6:45 through 52 and John 6:15 through 21, of course, it's Jesus, and it's only Jesus. But in Matthew 14:22 through 33, Peter also walks on the water. Do you mean that it really was Jesus and Peter, but Mark and John both figured, I'm kind of running low on ink. I think I'll leave Pete out. It just is ridiculous, and it's obvious why Matthew added Peter. He stands for Christians with hesitant faith, because what happens when he does? leave the boat and walk. He's like Wile E. Coyote, runs off the ledge and doesn't realize it to begin with. And as long as he thinks there's ground under him, he keeps walking, and then he realizes there isn't, and woo, down he goes. And that's kind of what happens. But Peter begins to plummet when he says, "Hey, look at this! I'm walking on water. What am I doing?" And Jesus reaches out to him and says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Yeah. Why would a guy doubt that he's walking with no solid ground? Anyway, it's obvious. The point of the story is, Christian, you're in the midst of a stormy sea of temptations and trials in your life, and you think you're going to sink, but you look unto Jesus and he'll pull you through. I mean, obviously, that's what it's about. So, again, purposely rewriting the story as a lesson of faith, not about what a Superman Jesus is, that he can defy gravity. That's kind of the point in Mark and John. But Matthew says, well, we can kind of take that for granted, but what about you and your faith in Jesus? So he's rewritten the story. He's not making a mistake. He's not trying to deceive anybody. He's trying to reapply a sacred story. Well, another one from Matthew, he likes to double characters that were single in earlier versions. The great story of the Gerasene demoniac, or depending on what manuscript, the Gadarene demoniac. Mark 5, 1 through 20, Luke 8, 26 through 39, or did he heal 2 demoniacs in Matthew 8, 28 through 34? Same story, right? The first instance of devil Ham, right? He meets this guy with Herculean strength who's insane because he's possessed by thousands of demons. That's what legion denoted. And Jesus cast the demons out, but they bargained with him. They said, "Look, we don't really want to move to another neighborhood. How about letting us invade those unclean pigs over there on the hillside? If it's all the same to you." And Jesus said, "Oh, be my guest." But this so freaks out the pigs that they stampede like lemmings over the edge, even though there wasn't a ledge in Gerasa, and all drown. In both that happens, but the demoniac in Matthew has a partner. There's 2 of them, like a wrestling tag team, I guess. Why? It's hard to say, except that he has this tendency to double characters. It's possible he misunderstood the legion remark and thought that the guy was saying, we are many, well, 2 at least, but who knows? No way to get rid of that one. By the way, no version of it appears in the Gospel of John. Well, here's another goodie. Did Jesus ride 1 donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday? Well, that's what it says in Mark 11, 1 through 10, and Luke 19, 28 through 38, and John 12, 12 through 15, but not in Matthew. Matthew 21, 1 through 9 has him riding 2 donkeys. Was it like 1 foot on each back, rodeo style, or what? What changed that? Well, I think this is pretty obvious, actually. It has to do with the form of Hebrew poetry. They're quoting a passage from Zechariah and says, "Behold, Jerusalem, your king comes to you in peace," implicitly, riding a donkey, seated on a donkey on the foal of an ass. Well, that's 2 ways of saying the same thing. A donkey, yes, the colt of a donkey. And it means, 1, that it's not a mule, in other words. It's a donkey, purebred. And because, mule is half horse, half donkey. So they're trying to say, yeah, this is a donkey, not one of those crummy mules. And ancient Hebrew scribes understood that's how Jewish Hebrew poetry worked. when they wrote it themselves. But when they looked back at the Bible, they pretended, no, they're telling us more information. And Matthew, a Jewish scribe, approached the Zechariah quote that way. Oh, what? Two beasts? A donkey and a donkey junior? Yeah, sure, that's it. So once again, it's not the way it happened, if anything happened at all, but you can tell very easily why Matthew rewrote it. It's not just an error. It's poetic diction and so on, literalized.
Hmm. I've heard that in one of the accounts he comes on a horse. Is that true or
No,
okay?
no,
Okay.
no, never. I'm amazed anybody would say that.
Okay. Yeah, I was just asking.
Yeah, I've heard other weird ones that people couldn't possibly have derived from the text. See, what happened when he got there with the temple ruckus? Well, of course, he cleansed the temple, right? He kicked out all the money changers who were there to change Roman coins for Jewish and Philistine coins because the latter did not have idolatrous, quote unquote, human portraits on them. And there were animals there, so you could buy a sacrificial animal rather than dragging one to Jerusalem from the Galilean hill country. So there were good reasons for him being there, but for whatever reason, Jesus kicks them all out and creates quite a disturbance. Well, when did he do it? According to Mark 11, Luke 19, Matthew 21, right at the his coming into Jerusalem. Though even there, it's a little peculiar in that Mark has him go into Jerusalem with the triumphal entry, take a look around, and leave, and then come back the next day and kick everybody out. Forget how Luke does it, but Matthew has the whole thing happen at once. On his way in, he curses the fig tree, then goes into the temple, kicks everybody out. I don't know which version is original, but it's worse than that in John because Jesus does it at the beginning of his public ministry in John chapter 2. It's obviously the same event. Why is it placed one at the beginning, the other at the end? He couldn't have gotten away with it twice. And according to the story, he didn't get away with it once, right? This is the thing that prompted the authorities to have him arrested and killed, right? So he couldn't have done it twice. Well, the reason for it is pretty plain because John likes to make the whole ministry of Jesus, which is punctuated by encounters with the scribes and Pharisees who try to kill him on the spot for blasphemy. He extends it through the whole gospel so that the whole story, in effect, is the trial of Jesus. And this is why John is filled with this testimony business. If I bear witness to myself, it's not valid, but it's my Father that sent me who bears witness to me. But even if I do bear witness to myself, it's true, and this and that. You listen to John because he testified of me, and so on and so forth. It's all because he's made the whole story into the trial of Jesus. And this is why also we have Jesus' ministry lasting implicitly for 3 years in John, but probably no more than a year in the other Gospels, because John doesn't care about actual chronology. Well, the others don't either, really, but apparently he has 3 different Passovers because he wants to teach 3 symbolic lessons about Passover, and so he needs to have Jesus speaking at 3 different Passovers. And so you can explain it. It's not just a stupid mistake, but you have to give up the inerrancy thing to understand why these differences exist. Well, I mentioned this before. Jesus is denied by the cowardly Peter. Let's see, whom and in what order did Peter answer when he denied Jesus 3 times? A maid twice and then some bystanders? That's what Mark 14 has. a maid, another maid subsequently, and a different one, in other words, unlike in Mark, and then some bystanders who were unspecified, as in Matthew 26. Or was it a maid, someone else, and still another, as Luke has? Or with John, uh, the a maid who was a doorkeeper, then servants and officers, and then a manservant of the high priest. Which was it? You just can't get those all together. There have been fundamentalist apologists that tried to do that, but in order to get them all in, they have to say, well, it wasn't just three denials. Harold Lindsell, in his book, The Battle for the Bible, says there must have been 6 denials. And then others have said there must have been 8 or 9 just to get everybody in. But of course, it's absurd because all the Gospels have it as Peter, you will deny me 3 times. I mean, why would he specify 3 if there were going to be loads of them? Well, those are his favorite denials, the ones he wanted to emphasize. Sounds like Adam Schiff here. When was Jesus crucified? Was he crucified on Passover, as in John 19, or on the day after? That's the other Gospels, because they already have the Last Supper as a Passover Seder, and Jesus is crucified the next day. But it's not a Passover meal in John, as it mentions how right in the middle of whatever supper it was, Judas went out, and the others thought, well, he's buying supplies for the Passover meal, which therefore they cannot have been eating at the moment. Well, what's going on? Why different chronologies here? Well, some like to say, well, you see, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by some Jewish group who had a different ritual calendar. Well, that was a big deal in ancient Judaism. We're going to go by the solar or the lunar calendar and so on. And they were concerned about that because they wanted to observe the different holy days on the right day of the week. And that's different depending on your calendar. And so the Qumran sect, the Essenes, whoever they were, had a different calendar than the Jews associated with the Jerusalem temple. And so the theory is that, well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus observing this sectarian alternate calendar, but John has the actual calendar that the Jerusalem authorities did. Why? And I mean, that's well, you could sort of try to get out of that, but as I already said, John says it's not a Passover, that they're preparing for it, whereas the synoptics say that it is the Passover. Oh boy. Did the women see the risen Jesus at the tomb? Well, in Matthew 28, yes, they did. They beheld Jesus himself, and he spoke to them. Or was it only the 2 men that the women saw, as in Luke 24, but not Jesus himself? Now, did most of the women see nothing, as in John 20, leaving Mary Magdalene to see Jesus by himself a few verses later? You just can't get that together. Who was the first appearance of Jesus vouchsafed to when he rose? Well, in Luke 24, 36 through 43, and the parallel story in John 20, 19 through 23, appears, he's suddenly in their midst, right? And they're amazed. That seems to be intended as the initial resurrection appearance. They're all shocked. What? And he said, don't worry, I'm alive. But then in John 21, when Jesus appears to them as they're in the boat and he's on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, John 21, 1 through 13, they seem to be seeing Jesus for the first time. What is going on? Well, somebody has already tried to harmonize this by adding verse 14 to chapter 21, where it says, this was the second time he'd appeared to them. But if you look at the story itself, they're just out fishing, right? There's no apostolic work or anything. And they say, hey, do you realize who that is on the shore? It is the Lord. And Peter can't wait, so he dives into the drink and dog paddles back in. It's pretty obvious that's supposed to be the shocking appearance. Now, where did he first appear? Did he first appear only in the environs of Jerusalem? Well, Luke 24, 13, and 49 imply that, because Emmaus was not far, as the text points out, was not very far from Jerusalem. And later, Luke has Jesus say, don't leave Jerusalem, but wait for the blessing of my Father at Pentecost. Or did he appear only in Galilee, according to Mark 16 and Matthew 28, 3 times, verses 7, 10, and 16? Did the angel tell the women, remember how he said he would meet you in Galilee? It's Mark 16, 7. Or did they say, as in Luke 24, 6, remember how when he was in Galilee, he told you the Son of Man must rise? Now, that's rather different, right? And it fits the agenda. Mark isn't going to have him go to Galilee. No, I'm sorry, Mark is going to have him go to Galilee. And so he says, let's get that straight again. He says that the angel says the women, he said he would meet you in Galilee, and so that's where they go, presumably. In Matthew, they definitely go. But in Luke, who says, remember how when he was in Galilee, he told you the Son of Man must rise. He doesn't say anything about going to Galilee, and indeed they don't. They're just in Jerusalem and Emmaus. That's no accident, right? You can see the process of redaction from one writer to the next. Did the women make the report the angels told them to make, or Jesus himself, if you throw in Matthew? Well, you got to choose between Mark 16:8, the last verse of the gospel, where the women flee the tomb and tell no one what they had seen. And now, other gospel writers apparently didn't like that ending. And so they have the women tell the disciples, after all, Matthew 28:8, Luke 24:10, John 20:18. Now, and all of those are quite different, which implies that, yeah, Mark simply didn't have any resurrection appearances, because these other gospels are following Mark, but when they get to this, it's suddenly the railroad runs out of track, and they want Jesus to appear. And so they make up very different stories, which means they had no tradition to work with. They're winging it. And in fact, they can't continue the story without rejecting Mark's ending, right? Because you can't have them obey the orders given to the women if the women don't relay the orders. So they have to reject Mark's ending and come up with something else. It's fiction. It has to be. What else could it be? Let's see. And of course, some copyists of Mark did the same thing. Well, this can't be the end. And so they added 2 or 3 different versions of what they thought would have happened. And but probably it did end with the absence of the body, because there's similar stories in other Greco-Roman stories of the ascensions of various heroes and demigods where you don't see it happen, but witnesses say, oh, there's no body there anymore. Romulus or Hercules or whoever must have ascended to heaven. That would have been enough. Apparently for Mark it was. Were there 2 ascensions?
I was going to ask you real quick, Dr. Bob, on that note. I think this is relevant. There was a Journal of Higher Criticism recently published by ours truly, the historicist Christopher Hansen, and he comes against Richard Carrier, Dr. Richard Carrier's idea. I believe it was Zareth. Well, no, who was the god? I didn't get
Moxus.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on that? Do you have a brief? And I know you would obviously have to write something. You read it, I'm sure.
Yes, I did. I can't quite remember why he thinks that wasn't an example of a dying and rising God. I think it was that it was left open in the story as to whether he had hidden and or been lost track of and appeared again or what, but I think it was something like that, but I've already forgotten the details.
You read
But
so much.
there's a book by called Resurrection and Reception by Richard C. Miller, who shows 79 ancient instances of ascension narratives, many of whom have no appearance of other ancient heroes. So you really don't need Zalmoxis to make the case.
Okay, just figure I'd ask. Don't want a rabbit trail.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Let's see. So, did Jesus ascend to heaven on the evening of Easter Day? Well, if you read Luke 24, he did. There's all the appearances in Luke 24 are explicitly set on the same day, later that day, later the same day, etc. And then at the end, he parts from them and goes up to heaven. But in fact, the references are in Luke 24, verses 13, 33, and 36, and then on to 50 through 52. That wouldn't be a problem, except that in Acts 1, 3 through 9, which was either written by the same author or somebody else was writing a sequel to Luke, we don't really know. In Acts 1, 3, and 9, Jesus ascends in full view of the disciples 40 days later. Was he going back and forth, bouncing up and down between earth and heaven? No, I mean, you'd really have to read that in, and I don't see what the point of it would be, because in Acts, he stays with the disciples for the 40 days, teaching them secret stuff. And then at the end of it, goes up to heaven, which was a common apocalyptic and Gnostic theme. They thought that Enoch had gone up to heaven and then came back to tell his children what he had learned in heaven and then went up for good. But that doesn't really work here, because nobody mentions two of them. There's the ascension on Easter Day in Luke, and 40 days later in Acts. So I suppose you could say, if it's the same author, he figured you would infer that, but that seems dubious to me. You'd think there'd be some reference like this is the second time he appeared to them after his death. And this gets even worse, because though it might be a clue to why this is the case, in some manuscripts of Luke 24, when it says he lifted up his hands and was parted from them, it doesn't go on to say and was carried up to heaven. Well, what does that mean? That he just left the area that for the day? I mean, that's not out of the question. But you wonder if somebody snipped the and was carried up to heaven in order to make the Acts 1 the only ascension narrative. So there's a place where you might solve the contradiction, but by an equally worrisome uncertainty about the text. Well, what is it I'm supposed to believe? What was the original text? So there are, one last one from Acts involving Paul. When Paul's on the road to Damascus for a fun afternoon of persecution, he this encounter with the risen Christ. and it doesn't describe him, but it says that Paul's companions like him hear the voice of Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why do you kick against the goads? Uh, according to Acts 9:7, his companions hear that voice, but they don't see anything. Yet in Acts 22, where Paul is telling the story for himself, his companions see the light, but don't hear the voice. Which is it? Well, that's not too hard to explain. It might be just that Luke forgot what he had said before. I mean, that wouldn't be too surprising, and that would be a goof, though I don't know how serious. But the whole thing appears to be based on Ezekiel, where he sees the spaceship come down by the riverside and nobody else does. It's probably inspired by that. But nonetheless, scholars suggest that if Luke was going to tell the same story more than once, and he does tell the story yet again in chapter 26, I think, telling the mob in Jerusalem about it. If he's gonna, and there are other changes too. Ananias drops out of one version of it, and that a technique was to give it some variety so that you're not just bored. Oh yeah, I've read this before. Well, all right, maybe that was it. But if he's doing that, it's a legitimate literary technique. But you're not dealing with a factually inerrant text. You might as well admit it. Everett Harrison, one of the neo-evangelicals, I think at Fuller Seminary back in the 50s, said, he wrote this interesting essay on I forget the title, but what do you mean by inerrancy? And he says it would be silly to impose on these ancient writers a standard of inerrancy or errancy, accuracy or inaccuracy, that's anachronistic. You have to ask what was allowable in their time and culture. They didn't write the way we do. And he's exactly right. But the problem he didn't see was that opens up the door to demythologizing and all kinds of stuff. He's actually joining the opposite team there of critical scholarship. He just didn't want to carry it very far. But anyway, that's my favorite 28 biblical contradictions, and you just can't get out of them.
I love it. I love it. And there's so many more, I'm sure. What book do you have published right now that's close to this these contradictions that you particularly discuss?
Well, one focusing on the Gospels would be The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. I have a lot of it in there. And in the first volume of Holy Fable, dealing with the Old Testament, there's a lot of this in there as well.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have famous, I love to call you famous. Actually, I'm going to start calling you the small Paul. You're the greatest sinner of them all, right? Go down in the description. If you guys are a fan of this work, you hear what Dr. Bob is bringing to the table, please, I call him Dr. Bob. It's Dr. Robert.m.price. Search him up on Amazon. Go down there. There's the links. Show him some love. Get the books. It's not expensive to get it electronic. I mean, modern day society is not reading the text in paper form anymore a lot of times. But if at the very least do that, he has some audio books as well. If you're retarded like me, sorry, I'm just going to use the word. That's just how I am, man. I can't read, and it's not that, man. I have a lazy eye, so I have a pain in the butt trying to focus and to reread what I'm saying over and over. I got to clown myself, but make sure you guys go show him some love. And at the very least, if you got a few bucks to spare, like I do, I go to his website, robert.m.price, mindvendor.com, something to that effect. Just Google Robert M. Price, and it'll pop up, and you'll see Mindvendor. I'll put it in the description if you're willing to know where that's at. Go give him a PayPal. Become a patron. You get all his sneak peek, secrets and stuff that he shares on his Patreon, and become a monthly contributor. I appreciate you joining me, Dr. Bob, and I hope we don't live lives of contradictions, but I think we all do. Hey guys, gals, hope you guys caught that. Hope you enjoyed that. There are so many more contradictions, Dr. Bob said, in the New Testament and the Old Testament. Shoot, I remember seeing Dr. Bart Ehrman talk about how there are more contradictions in the Old Testament than there are in the New. But Dr. Bob decided he would bring his own little favorites, if you will, on the touch here pertaining to the contradictions in the New Testament. I hope he writes that book, and if he does, I look forward to getting it pertaining to the Gospels collide, you know. So I love you guys. Thanks for supporting what we do. And if you like what we're doing, you want to see certain guests, and you want to help contribute, we do have the PayPals down in the description that you can contribute a donation to help us out, or even a monthly, you know, contribution there in the Patreon. Love you guys. Peace.